The creditors took everything except what Clara could carry. She stood in the hollow shell of her Boston townhouse, watching strangers wrap her mother's china in yesterday's newspaper. 23 years of life reduced to one carpet bag and a trunk too heavy for her arms. The mahogany furniture went first, then the silver. Finally, the portraits that had watched her grow from child to woman to orphan to pauper. Uncle Theodore's letter trembled in her gloved hand. Marriage contract. Jonas Weatherby. Oregon Territory lumber merchant. Mutually beneficial arrangement. She unfastened her mother's pearl necklace. Its weight familiar as breathing. The pawnbroker offered enough for stagecoach fare and 3 months' modest living. Clara accepted, keeping only one silk glove tucked against her heart proof she had once been someone else. The Wells Fargo stage waited in the gray morning drizzle. Clara climbed aboard, her morning dress already gathering dust. Boston disappeared behind her, swallowed by mist and necessity. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The stagecoach lurched to a stop at Salmon Creek Crossing, 5 days out from Boston. Clara's bones ached from the constant jarring, her whalebone corset cutting into ribs already bruised from the journey's relentless pace. Everybody out. The driver's voice cracked like a whip. Spring runoffs made her angry. Coach goes through empty while you folks walk across them rocks. Clara gathered her mud-stained skirts and descended into Oregon Territory's indifferent wilderness. The other passengers, a Methodist minister and his wife, 2 mining speculators, and a traveling merchant were already picking their way toward the river stones that served as a crude crossing. The water ran brown and fierce, swollen with snowmelt from mountains she couldn't yet see. The driver and his assistant began unhitching the horses, preparing to guide the empty coach through the current. "Watch your step, miss," the minister's wife called back. "These rocks are treacherous." Clara's city boots, fine kid leather meant for Boston's cobblestones, found no purchase on the slick stones. She gripped her carpet bag tighter, using a broken branch as a walking stick. The first stone held, the second shifted slightly. On the third, her heel caught in a crevice. The world tilted. Her arms windmilled uselessly as her skirts tangled around her legs. The carpet bag flew from her grip as she pitched sideways into the current. Ice-cold water closed over her head. The river seized her skirts, transforming yards of bombazine and petticoats into anchors. Her corset, already tight, became a vice around her lungs. She broke the surface gasping, only to be pulled under again by the weight of waterlogged fabric. Clara's fingers scraped against rocks, finding nothing to hold. The current spun her like a leaf, her lungs burned. Black spots danced across her vision. Through the roar of water, she heard distant shouting. Then strong hands caught her arms. Someone hauled her up with steady, economical strength, dragging her against the current toward the bank. Her rescuer said nothing, just pulled her onto solid ground and immediately began working at the ties of her sodden cloak. Clara coughed up river water, shivering violently. The man, she could see him now through her streaming hair, moved with practiced efficiency. Weathered face, broad shoulders, sawdust caught in his dark beard. He peeled away her cloak and wrapped her in his own wool coat. Warm from his body and smelling of pine pitch and honest sweat, while the other passengers fluttered around her with exclamations and advice, he built a fire. His hands, scarred and calloused, struck lucifer matches from a tin he kept wrapped in oilcloth. He fed the flames with dry kindling pulled from beneath a canvas tarp near the crossing, supplies kept for emergencies. She realized. "Thank you," Clara managed through chattering teeth. He glanced at her, eyes the color of deep water but calmer. "Fire'll warm you soon enough." The minister's wife fussed with Clara's hair, wringing out what she could. "Such a fright you could have drowned, sir. We're indebted to your quick action." The man added another branch to the fire, saying nothing. Clara noticed the copper rivets on his denim pants, the hickory axe handle leaning against a nearby tree, she assumed. His movements were unhurried but never wasted, each gesture accomplishing exactly what was needed. "Elias works the sawmill up the road," the driver explained, returning from securing the coach on the far bank. "Best timberman in 3 counties. Lucky he was checking his timber floats today." Elias. Clara stored the name away, along with the sensation of being rescued without ceremony or expectation. In Boston. A gentleman would have made much of such heroics, would have expected grateful tears and perhaps some promise of reward. This man just tended his fire and occasionally glanced at her to gauge if she'd stopped shaking. The merchant had retrieved her carpetbag from downstream, waterlogged but intact. Clara's marriage contract, sealed in oilcloth within, remained dry, that binding document that promised her to a stranger still waiting somewhere ahead. "You'll want dry clothes," Elias said finally, his voice low and measured. "Mill's not far. Mrs. Holbrook keeps spare things for the lumber families." He stood, collecting his axe. Without asking, he took her carpetbag from the merchant and slung it over his shoulder. The assumption that she would follow felt neither presumptuous nor commanding, simply practical, like everything else about him. Clara rose on unsteady legs, still wrapped in his coat. She noticed how he walked slightly ahead but kept glancing back, making sure she managed the rough path. His boots, heavy and sure, had known every stone at that crossing. Those hands that had pulled her from the river bore the history of honest labor scars from saws, calluses from axes, a thumb that had been broken and healed crooked. The other passengers would wait for the next coach, but Clara followed this silent man toward the sound of sawing that drifted through the trees, toward whatever shelter his world might offer. Her Boston life lay drowned in that river, her future still uncertain as the Oregon sky. She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders and walked on. The sawmill announced itself first through sound, the rhythmic bite of steel through wood, the shouts of men coordinating labor, the splash of logs hitting the mill pond. Then came the scent, fresh-cut pine so sharp it cleared Clara's head better than smelling salts. Finally, as they crested a small rise, the operation itself spread before her like a small city of industry. Buildings clustered around the main mill structure, a massive barn-like edifice with steam rising from its roof. Smaller cabins dotted the clearing's edges, smoke drifting from their chimneys. Children played between stacks of lumber while women hung washing on lines stretched between poles. It was chaos and order combined, everyone moving with evident purpose. "This way," Elias said, leading her toward a larger building that leaked the promising smell of baking bread. The cookhouse door opened before they reached it. A woman emerged, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, arms dusted with flour. Her eyes took in Clara's sodden state with practical assessment. "River got another one, did it?" She stepped aside, ushering them in. "Come now, we'll get you sorted. Elias, tell Tommy to bring the spare clothes trunk from the storeroom." The cookhouse's warmth hit Clara like a blessing. Long trestle tables filled the space, their surfaces covered in blue checkered oilcloth. An enormous stove dominated one wall, its nickel fittings gleaming. Enamel coffee pots steamed on every surface. The room could easily seat 50 men, Clara estimated, maybe more. Mrs. Holbrook, for this had to be, she was already pouring hot water from a kettle into a basin. "You can wash up proper once you're in dry things. Been traveling far?" "Boston," Clara managed through still chattering teeth. "Mercy." Mrs. Holbrook's eyebrows rose. "That's a journey and a half. What brings a Boston lady to our muddy corner of creation?" Clara hesitated. The marriage contract pressed against her ribs where she'd tucked it inside her corset for safekeeping. "I'm expected. Mr. Jonas Weatherby." The silence that fell was sudden and complete. Mrs. Holbrook's hand stilled on the towel she'd been unfolding. From the doorway where he'd paused, Elias turned slowly. "Weatherby." Mrs. Holbrook's tone had gone carefully neutral. "I see." A boy arrived with a trunk, saving Clara from immediate response. Mrs. Holbrook shooed the men out and helped Clara from her wet things with the efficiency of someone who'd raised daughters. The calico dress she produced was well-worn but clean, smelling of lye soap and sunshine. It was too large in the shoulders, too short in the hem, and Clara had never been more grateful for a garment in her life. "There now." Mrs. Holbrook stepped back, surveying her work. You look almost human again. Come, let's get some food in you." She served Clara thick slices of bread with butter, a bowl of bean soup, coffee black enough to stand a spoon in. Clara ate while Mrs. Holbrook worked, kneading dough for the evening meal, through the windows. Clara watched the mill's operation men guiding massive logs onto carriages, the great circular saw blade shrieking through timber, fresh planks stacking higher than houses. "You're Mrs. Holbrook said carefully, not looking up from her dough. "He hasn't been around much lately. We haven't actually met. It's an arrangement through my uncle. A business partnership." "Ah." The older woman's shoulders relaxed slightly. "One of those situations. Well, truth be told, Mr. Weatherby hasn't been seen in town for near on 3 weeks now. Course, he travels for business quite regular." Through the window, Clara spotted Elias at a workbench near the main mill. He'd shed his jacket, working in shirt sleeves despite the cool air. She watched him run a plane along a board, each stroke deliberate and smooth, long curls of wood peeled away, revealing golden grain beneath. The board transformed under his hands from rough-cut lumber to something refined, useful, beautiful even. She'd never seen anyone make something before. In Boston, things simply appeared: furniture from shops, clothes from seamstresses, food from markets. But here was creation at its most fundamental. Tree became board. Board became shelter. "He's a good man, Elias," Mrs. Holbrook said, following Clara's gaze. "Lost his wife 8 winters back. Never took up with anyone after. Just works his wood and keeps his peace." The door banged open, admitting a thin man in a town suit gone shabby at the elbows. "Mrs. H, you got any coffee that ain't strong enough to float horseshoes? My stomach's giving me fits again." "Mr. Cranshaw, you know my coffee's the same as it's been for 15 years. Clara, this here's our postmaster. Mr. Cranshaw, Miss Clara's come from Boston to meet Mr. Weatherby." Cranshaw's expression went through several variations of surprise and concern. "That's so. Well now, miss, I hate to bear troublesome news, but there's been some developments regarding Mr. Weatherby's affairs." Clara set down her coffee cup. "Developments. Debts, mainly. Owes 3 months' wages to the mill workers. Been selling lumber contracts he can't fill. There's talk he's negotiating with some syndicate from San Francisco wants to sell out complete timber rights and all. But surely he wouldn't abandon his obligations. My uncle said he was prosperous, established." Cranshaw and Mrs. Holbrook exchanged glances. "Maybe," Cranshaw admitted. "But frontier prosperity's a chancy thing. Markets change. Debts mount. Your uncle might not have had the latest information." Clara felt the floor shifting beneath her like those river stones. She'd traveled 3,000 miles to marry a stranger who might not even exist anymore, at least not as advertised. Her small remaining funds wouldn't get her back to Boston, and there was nothing there anyway except creditors and shame. Elias entered, bringing the smell of sawdust and resin. He poured himself coffee and stood by the stove, his presence solid and unobtrusive. "Miss Clara needs lodging," he said to Mrs. Holbrook. "Widow Taylor's got that empty room since her daughter married." "I couldn't impose," Clara began. "Not imposing." Elias glanced at her, brief but direct. "Town looks after its own. But I'm not—" "You're here," he said simply. "That's enough for now." Evening fell while they discussed arrangements. Workers began filing in for supper. Rough men with tired faces who nodded politely at Clara before taking their places at the long tables. She helped Mrs. Holbrook serve, carrying platters of cornbread and pots of stew. The men ate with focused purpose, talking about footage cut, orders filled, equipment needing repair. One man mentioned replanting the north slope next month. Another argued for leaving it fallow a season. Elias settled it with a few quiet words about watershed protection and erosion. Clara understood then that this wasn't the clear cutting she'd read about in Boston papers. These men were gardeners of the forest, harvesting but also tending. "You folks back east," one worker said to Clara, "you probably think we're just out here stripping the land bare." "I didn't know what to think," Clara admitted. I've never seen anything like this before. The man grinned, gaps in his teeth. Stick around, miss. Lot to learn about timber if you're interested. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself accepted without question into the mill's rhythm. She cleared plates, poured coffee, listened to stories of logs that got away and saws that bound up in the cut. No one asked about her circumstances or her connection to Weatherby. She was simply there, helping, and that seemed to be enough. Elias walked her to Widow Taylor's as full dark settled. Kerosene lanterns bobbed throughout the settlement like fireflies. He carried her carpetbag, now somewhat dried, and said nothing until they reached the small, neat cabin with light glowing warm in its windows. Weatherby might still turn up, he said. Men sometimes need to disappear for a while, then come back when they've sorted themselves. And if he doesn't, Elias looked at her straight on for the first time since the river. Then you'll decide what comes next. But you don't have to decide tonight. He handed her the carpetbag and touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that belonged to no particular class, but simply acknowledged one human to another. Clara watched him walk back toward the mill, his figure solid against the lamplight. Inside the carpetbag, the marriage contract remained in its oilcloth wrapping, still binding her to a future that seemed less certain with each passing hour. But for tonight, she had a roof and a bed and the memory of golden wood curling beneath steady hands, proof that some things could be shaped rather than simply endured. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of axes already at work. 3 days had passed since her arrival. 3 days of waiting for word from Weatherby that never came. She dressed in the borrowed calico, her fingers fumbling with buttons in the cold. Widow Taylor's spare room was clean but sparse, a rope bed, a washstand, hooks for clothes she didn't possess. The morning air bit sharp as she crossed to the cookhouse. Stars still pricked the sky above the tree line. Mrs. Holbrook was already at work, her broad form moving between stove and table with practiced rhythm. "You don't need to be up yet," the older woman said, not unkindly. "I can't take charity without giving something back." Clara picked up the kindling bucket. "Show me what needs doing." Mrs. Holbrook studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fire first. These old iron stoves are particular need to warm gradual or they crack. Then we'll start the biscuits." The cook stove was a monster of cast iron and nickel, 6 burners and 2 ovens. Excelsior stamped proud across its face. Clara fed it splits of pine and fir, learning to read its moods through the sound of draft and flame. Mrs. Holbrook showed her the proportions: 3 cups of flour to a handful of lard, saleratus measured in pinches, buttermilk added until the dough felt right. "Feel is everything in cooking," Mrs. Bisbee Holbrook explained, her hands working the dough with economical grace. "Recipes are just suggestions. The weather, the flour, the heat of your oven, everything changes what's needed." By the time the mill whistle blew, they had 4 dozen biscuits browning, pots of beans that had simmered all night, slabs of salt pork crisping in cast iron skillets. The blue enamel coffee boiler, large enough to bathe a child, steamed with coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe nail. Mrs. Holbrook demonstrated this literally. To Clara's amazement, the men filed in, bringing cold and hunger and the smell of fresh sawdust. They ate with focus, fueling themselves for another day's labor. Clara moved among them with coffee pot and platters, learning names and faces. Tom Brennan, who ran the head saw. Andy Chen, who managed the pond, keeping logs sorted and ready. Old Pete, who filed the great circular blades, keeping them sharp enough to shave with. After breakfast, while Mrs. Holbrook started preparations for the noon meal, Clara noticed the mill's office, a small building attached to the main structure, its windows dusty with neglect. "Mr. Weatherby's domain," Mrs. Holbrook said, following her gaze. "Though he hasn't darkened its door in a month or more. Papers piling up, I expect." "Might I look?" Clara asked. "I helped with my father's accounts before the end. Perhaps I could make some sense of things." Mrs. Holbrook fetched a key from behind a loose board. Can't hurt to try. The office was chaos. Ledgers lay open on every surface, their marbled edges gray with sawdust. Correspondence teetered in unstable piles. Invoices, receipts, and contracts covered the desk in geological layers, the smell of old paper and ink mixed with ever-present pine resin. Clara began with the most recent ledger, working backward. Her father had taught her double-entry bookkeeping, the elegant balance of debit and credit. But these books were a disaster, numbers that didn't sum. Entries made then crossed out, whole pages torn free. As the morning wore on, a pattern emerged. Weatherby had been selling the same lumber twice, sometimes 3 times, to different buyers, taking payment in advance, then failing to deliver. The good lumber went to whoever paid extra under the table. The inferior cuts wood with shake and rot got passed off to legitimate customers who'd paid honest prices. Finding anything interesting, Elias stood in the doorway, backlit by noon sun. Finding that Mr. Weatherby is either a very poor businessman or a very accomplished thief, Clara showed him the ledgers. He owes the mill over $2,000 in wages, and he's been selling lumber that doesn't exist to buyers in Portland and San Francisco. Elias examined the books, his face darkening. That explains the complaints we've been getting. Buyers saying our wood's not what was promised. 20 years building this mill's reputation, and he's destroying it in 6 months. There's more. Clara pulled out a folder marked Syndicate Correspondence. He's negotiating to sell the timber rights. All of them. The entire mountain. Elias went very still. Clear cutting. They call it maximum resource extraction. They'd strip everything, leave nothing for regrowth. That would destroy the watershed. The town depends on that water. The farms downstream, too. He set down the papers carefully, as if they might explode. The men need to know about this. Wait. Clara studied the contracts more carefully. These aren't properly executed. See? He's signed. But there's no witness. No notary seal. And this clause, she pointed to fine print. The sale's contingent on clear title. But according to these papers, he doesn't have clear title. The original owner retained a percentage interest. 20% of the mill belongs to someone named Margaret Foster. Widow Foster. She was old man Foster's wife. Him who started the mill. Moved to Salem after he died. Weatherby said he bought her out. He didn't. Or if he did, it's not recorded here. Clara felt the stirring of an idea. If we could contact her, make sure she knows what he's planning. She'd never agree to clear cutting. Her husband planted half this forest himself, by hand. They worked through lunch, Clara explaining the financial tangles while Elias provided context about the mill's operations. When Mrs. Holbrook called them for the noon meal, they emerged blinking into sunlight like awakened owls. That afternoon, Elias offered to show Clara the lumberyard, to help her understand what the numbers in the ledgers actually represented. They walked between towers of stacked planks, each pile marked with tally sticks showing grade and footage. Here. Elias pulled out a board, running his hand along its length. See the grain? Tight and straight means strength. This is what we call vertical grain, best for building. Now look at this one. He selected another board. See how the grain curves? That's flat sawn. Fine for siding, but won't hold weight. Clara touched the wood, feeling the difference in texture. It's beautiful, like looking at the tree's history. Every ring's a year of growth. Tight rings mean hard years' drought, cold. Wide rings mean good water, warm summers. He pointed to the board's center. This dark part's heartwood, the tree's oldest growth. Dense and full of resin, resists rot. The lighter wood's sapwood, newer growth. Strong but needs protecting. He handed her a piece of heartwood, then one of sapwood. The difference in weight was remarkable. Clara found herself thinking about her own life. Was she heartwood or sap? Had her Boston years been soft growth that couldn't weather storms? Or was there something denser at her center, waiting to be revealed? You're taking to this quick, Elias observed. Most people just see boards. I'm seeing possibility. Clara hefted another plank, checking its grain as he'd shown her. A splinter drove into her palm, small but sharp. She picked it out, noticing the red mark it left. In Boston, I never made anything, just consumed what others created. That evening, after supper was served and cleaned, the workers gathered outside the cookhouse with their families. Someone produced a fiddle, another a harmonica. Children danced while their parents clapped time. Clara sat on the cookhouse steps, watching Elias whittle a toy horse for one of the little girls. The workers' wives had begun accepting her, teaching her their skills. Sarah Brennan showed her how to make lye soap from wood ash and pork fat. Mary Chen demonstrated preserving vegetables in brine. Each lesson came with stories who married whom, which children belonged to which families, the web of connection that held the settlement together. You're fitting in, Widow Taylor said, settling beside Clara. Wouldn't know you were a Boston lady if we hadn't been told. Clara looked at her hands in the lantern light. Already they were changing a callus forming where she gripped the coffee pot handle, another from the broom. Her nails, once polished and shaped, were now short and practical. That splinter from the lumber had left its small mark. She flexed her fingers, feeling the new toughness forming. These hands were learning to create instead of merely receive. Tomorrow she would wake before dawn again, stoke the temperamental stove, make biscuits by feel rather than recipe. She would return to the ledgers and continue untangling Weatherby's deceit. She would learn more about wood and weather, profit and loss. The fiddle struck up a reel, and couples began dancing on the packed earth. Elias remained on the edge of the light, whittling steady and sure. He glanced up once, caught her watching, and nodded a brief acknowledgement of something unnamed but understood. Clara touched the callus on her palm again. It was small, insignificant maybe, but it was hers earned, not inherited. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt she might be becoming something more than what she'd lost. Not yet heartwood, perhaps, but no longer merely sapwood either. Something in between, still forming, ring by ring, day by day. The storm arrived without warning on Clara's 10th day at the mill. She woke to wind shrieking through the settlement, rain driving horizontal against Widow Taylor's windows. By dawn, the damage was clear roofs torn open, cedar shakes scattered like playing cards across the muddy ground. Every able hand was needed. Clara joined the work crews without being asked, her borrowed canvas coat already soaked through before she reached the first damaged cottage. The Brennan family's roof had lost a quarter of its shingles, rain pouring through into their small home. "Hold this steady." Elias appeared beside her, handing her one end of a board while he positioned it against the rafters. His movements were calm despite the urgency, each nail driven true despite the wind trying to tear the hammer from his grip. Clara braced the board with her shoulder, rain streaming down her neck. She'd never done such work before, but her body seemed to understand what was needed. Lean here, shift there, anticipate the rhythm of his hammer strokes. They moved from cottage to cottage, working without words, developing an understanding that transcended speech. At the Chen family's cabin, a massive fir branch had punched through the roof. Elias and Tom Brennan worked the two-man crosscut saw while Clara helped Mary Chen move her belongings away from the rain. The children huddled in the cookhouse with the other families, Mrs. Holbrook keeping them fed and calm. "Draw knife," Elias said. Once the branch was cleared, he showed Clara the tool, a blade with handles at both ends. "Need to smooth these rafters before we can patch." He positioned himself behind her, guiding her hands to the proper grip. "Pull toward you, steady pressure. Let the blade do the work." His hands covered hers, demonstrating the motion. Clara felt the warmth of him through her soaked clothes, solid and sure. The blade bit into the wood, peeling away damaged splinters to reveal clean pine beneath. For a moment, they remained like that, her hands learning the tool's rhythm, his hands teaching, then both seemed to realize the intimacy of their position. Neither pulled away immediately. The moment stretched. rain drumming on what remained of the roof, before Elias stepped back carefully. "You've got it," he said quietly. "Good hands for the work." They labored through the day, the entire settlement working as one body. By evening, temporary patches covered the worst damage. Tomorrow they would begin proper repairs, but tonight families could sleep dry. In the cookhouse, exhausted workers and their families gathered for supper. Clara's arms ached from holding boards. Her hands were blistered despite the calluses she'd thought were tough enough. She served stew with movements gone clumsy with fatigue. "Sit," Mrs. Holbrook commanded. "You've done enough." Clara sank onto a bench near the stove. Elias brought her coffee, sitting beside her with his own cup. They watched the family's children already recovering from the day's fear, playing with wood blocks someone had carved. The adults talked repairs, materials needed, work to be done. "You did well today," Elias said. "Not many would work that hard for people they barely know." "They're not strangers anymore." Clara flexed her blistered hands. "After today, I don't know what to call it. Community," he supplied. "Folk you'd rebuild for. And who'd rebuild for you?" The cookhouse gradually emptied as families returned to their patched homes. Clara helped with cleanup, moving slower than usual, when only she, Elias, and Mrs. Holbrook remained. The older woman declared herself done for the night and departed, leaving them alone by the dying stove. "Your hands need tending," Elias observed. He fetched a tin of salve from the shelf where Mrs. Holbrook kept remedies. "May I?" Clara extended her hands, palm up. He applied the salve gently, his rough fingers surprisingly delicate against her blisters. The silence felt full rather than empty, weighted with things unsaid but understood. "You never asked about my situation," Clara said. "About Weatherby, the marriage contract, any of it. Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. My father was a shipping merchant. Very successful. Or so we thought." She watched him work the salve into her skin. He was extending credit to everyone, trying to corner the market in textile imports. When the panic of '73 hit, all those credits came due at once. He couldn't cover them. Elias nodded, continuing his ministrations. "He shot himself in his study. Mother found him." Clara's voice stayed steady, though the memory still cut deep. "She never recovered. Died 2 years later. Doctor said her heart gave out. But I think she just stopped wanting to live. Grief can do that." His hands stilled on hers. "After she died, the last creditors took everything. My uncle arranged this marriage, sold me. Really. Though we call it something prettier, a business arrangement, beneficial to all parties." She laughed, short and bitter. "Except Weatherby doesn't seem to exist, at least not as advertised." Elias released her hands, capped the salve tin. "My Anna died birthing our son. He lived 3 days. He stared at the stove's glow through its grate. That was 8 years ago, come July. Haven't been able to. Haven't wanted to let anyone close since then. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's part of me now. Like tree rings, the hard years and the good, all part of the grain." He pulled something from his shirt pocket, a small daguerreotype in a brass case. A young woman's face, serious and lovely, stared out from the metal surface. "She would have liked you, would have admired how you pitched in today." Clara studied the image. This ghost who still held part of Elias's heart. She was beautiful. She was kind. That mattered more. He returned the photograph to his pocket, keeping it close to his heart. "I built our cabin planning for children. 4 bedrooms seemed reasonable. Now it's just me rattling around in all that space." They sat with their parallel losses, the stove ticking as it cooled. Outside, wind still gusted, but gentler now. The storm's fury had passed. "I should go," Clara said finally. "Dawn comes early." "I'll walk you." They picked their way through puddles and scattered debris. The settlement was quiet except for dogs barking and the distant sound of the mill wheel turning in the swollen creek. At Widow Taylor's door, Elias paused. "Whatever you decide about your future, you've got a place here as long as you need it. Thank you." Clara wanted to say more but couldn't find words that wouldn't disturb the delicate understanding between them. She was preparing for bed when Widow Taylor knocked. "Letter came while you were out working. Cranshaw brought it by." The envelope bore no postal marks, hand-delivered then. Clara recognized the oversized script before she opened it. Weatherby's hand, shaky with drink or nerves. "Miss Harrington, circumstances require immediate action regarding our arrangement. I have entered negotiations with the Pacific Lumber Syndicate that will resolve all debts and obligations. Your presence is required to sign necessary documents as my intended bride, which status provides certain legal advantages in the transfer of assets. I will send a man for you Thursday next. Please prepare yourself appropriately. J. Weatherby." Clara read it twice, then carried it to the kitchen where Widow Taylor was banking her fire for the night. "Bad news," the widow asked. "Mr. Weatherby has emerged. He wants me to sign papers. Something about a lumber syndicate. That'd be the clear-cutting outfit from San Francisco. They've destroyed forests from here to California." Widow Taylor's face darkened. "If he sells to them, this whole settlement's finished." Clara thought of the families she'd helped today, their children playing with wooden blocks, of Mrs. Holbrook's steady kindness, of Elias's work-scarred hands, gentle with salve on her blisters, of the mill itself, that careful balance between harvest and preservation. "I won't sign anything that hurts these people." "Might not have a choice. You're legally contracted to him, aren't you?" Clara fingered the letter. Cheap paper already soft from handling. Through the window, she could see a light in Elias's cabin across the settlement. He'd be sitting by his fire now, alone in those 4 empty bedrooms, carrying his grief like heartwood, dense and dark at the center, but strong enough to bear weight. "There's always a choice, then," she said. "Sometimes it just takes courage to see it." The next morning, she found Elias at the mill and showed him Weatherby's letter. His face went carefully neutral as he read. "Thursday's 3 days away," he said. 3 days to figure out how to stop him from destroying everything you've all built. He corrected quietly. "Everything we've built." The distinction mattered. Clara felt it settle into her chest like a promise. She thought of yesterday's storm, how they'd worked together without words, understanding flowing between them like shared breath, how his hands had covered hers on the draw knife, teaching and learning in the same moment. "Then we'd better get to work," she said. He almost smiled. She could see it threatening at the corners of his eyes. "Best fetch those ledgers. If we're going to fight, we need to know what weapons we have." They returned to the office, spreading papers across the desk. Outside, the mill continued its rhythm, saws singing, men shouting, the great wheel turning with the creek's flow. But inside the small office, Clara and Elias worked in concentrated quiet, searching for the leverage that might save everything. She was aware of him constantly, how he rolled his sleeves back to work, exposing forearms corded with muscle, how he absently touched his shirt pocket where the daguerreotype rested, how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, something unspoken warming his eyes. The morning aged into afternoon. Mrs. Holbrook brought them food they barely touched. Papers accumulated in sorted piles, debts here, contracts there, correspondence arranged by date. Somewhere in this chaos was the answer. They just had to find it before Thursday. As evening approached, Elias leaned back in his chair. "There's got to be something we're missing." Clara rubbed her eyes, the numbers beginning to blur. 3 days. 3 days to save the mill, the settlement, this fragile new life she was building ring by ring, like heartwood forming in secret at a tree's core. "We'll find it," she said, and meant it. "We have to." Elias looked at her across the desk, and for a moment his careful control slipped. She saw hunger there, not for her body but for the possibility of her. For the future that might exist if courage could overcome contracts. Yes, he said simply. We will. The draw knife sat on the desk between them, its blade catching the last light. Clara remembered his hands covering hers, teaching her to find the good wood beneath the damage. Perhaps that's what they were doing now, scraping away lies and greed to find something worth saving underneath. 3 days. The clock on the wall ticked steady as a heartbeat, counting down to Thursday's reckoning. Thursday arrived gray and bitter, matching Clara's mood. She stood in the cookhouse, helping serve breakfast while dread coiled in her stomach. The men ate quietly, aware of what this day meant. Word had spread through the settlement Weatherby's man was coming for Miss Clara. The stranger arrived just after 10 o'clock in a hired buggy, his appearance as oily as his manner. He wore a city suit gone shiny at the elbows, a boiled shirt collar yellowed with age, and a seal ring too large for his finger that he twisted constantly. His thin mustache looked painted on, and when he smiled, his teeth were stained brown from tobacco. "Miss Harrington," he announced, entering the cookhouse without knocking. "I am Josiah Grimm, Mr. Weatherby's associate. I've come to collect you." Clara set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. Around her, she felt the room shift. Mrs. Holbrook moving closer, the morning crew lingering instead of returning to work. "I wasn't aware I was something to be collected," Clara said. Grimm's smile widened unpleasantly. "Come now, miss. No need for dramatics. Mr. Weatherby is waiting in town with the syndicate representatives. Papers to sign, arrangements to finalize." "What papers?" "Why, the marriage documents." "Of course. And some transfer certificates. Nothing for you to concern yourself with. Mr. Weatherby will handle all the details. You simply need to sign where indicated." Elias appeared in the doorway, Tom Brennan and several other workers behind him. They arranged themselves casually, but Clara recognized the formation. They were blocking Grimm's exit. "Perhaps you could explain these documents more clearly," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. Grimm looked him up and down, taking in the work clothes, the sawdust. "This doesn't concern you, lumberman. Everything concerning this mill concerns me." Elias stepped into the room. "And Miss Harrington is under our protection." "Protection?" Grimm laughed, pulling a sheaf of foolscap papers from his coat. "She's under contract. See here, signed and witnessed. Her uncle, Theodore Harrington, entered into this agreement 4 months ago. Money changed hands. $500. To be precise." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. $500? "Your uncle's debts were substantial. Mr. Weatherby was generous to offer so much." Grimm waved the contract. "You are legally bound. Miss Harrington? Bought and paid for. Like livestock," Mrs. Holbrook said, her voice cutting. "Is that what you're saying, that this young woman was sold like a prize heifer?" "I'm saying she has a legal obligation." Grimm produced a bottle of purple copying ink and a pen. "Now, if you'll just sign these papers, we can proceed to town." Clara took the contract, reading it properly for the first time. The language was complex, full of whereas and heretofore, but the meaning was clear. Her uncle had indeed sold her, using words like arranged and contracted to disguise the transaction. "This is interesting," she said, voice steadier than her hands. "It says here the marriage must be performed within 60 days of my arrival in Oregon Territory." Yes, standard terms. "But I arrived 14 days ago. Where has Mr. Weatherby been?" Grimm shifted uncomfortably. "He's been attending to business matters." "What kind of business, Mrs. Holbrook moved closer, arms crossed. "Because I heard tell he's been drinking away his time in Portland. And that's not the worst of it. Madam, I don't see how gossip... It's not gossip when there's a legal record." Mrs. Holbrook's eyes were steel. "Mr. Weatherby was married before, to a girl from Salem. Sweet little thing named Rebecca. He abandoned her after 3 months. She had to seek refuge with her family. claimed he was violent when drunk. That's slander. That's testimony. It's in the circuit court records, if anyone cares to look. Mrs. Holbrook turned to Clara. Did your uncle know about that when he made this arrangement? The cookhouse door opened again. Reverend Palmer entered, the Methodist minister who'd been on the stagecoach when Clara arrived. Behind him came Cranshaw the postmaster, Judge Harrison from town, and several other settlement leaders. We heard there might be need of legal counsel, the judge said. He was an older man with sharp eyes and a face carved by years of frontier justice. Miss Harrington, might I see that contract? Clara handed it over gratefully. The judge read it, occasionally making small sounds of disapproval. Grimm's composure was cracking, sweat beading on his upper lip despite the cool morning. This is irregular, the judge finally said. Very irregular. Miss Harrington, did you sign this document? No, sir. My uncle signed it. And how old are you? 23. Then your uncle had no legal authority to sign for you. You're of age. The judge turned to Grimm. Furthermore, I see no evidence that Miss Harrington consented to this arrangement. The contract mentions her agreement but shows no signature. Her presence here indicates consent, Grimm sputtered. Her presence here indicates she received a letter from her uncle and traveled to Oregon Territory. Nothing more. The judge looked around the room. I also note that Mr. Weatherby has failed to fulfill his obligations under this contract. It states he would provide immediate lodging and support. Instead, Miss Harrington has been working for her keep here at the mill. Because she chose to, because Weatherby wasn't here to meet her. Elias said. He'd moved gradually closer during the discussion, now stood near Clara's shoulder. 14 days he's left her to fend for herself. That's abandonment of contract, the judge agreed. Any court would void this agreement. Grimm's face had gone red. Mr. Weatherby has influence. He has connections with the syndicate. They won't be pleased if this arrangement falls through. Are you threatening us? Tom Brennan stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfing Grimm. Other workers moved with him, forming a protective wall around Clara. I'm stating facts. The syndicate wants those timber rights. Mr. Weatherby needs this marriage to complete the sale, something about inheritance law and property transfer. Without it, the whole deal collapses. Then let it collapse, Clara said. I won't sign anything that allows clear-cutting of this forest. You don't have a choice. She does in Oregon. This from Reverend Palmer. The Married Women's Property Act of 1878. Even if this contract were valid, which it clearly isn't, she would retain rights to her own property in person. Oregon law is quite progressive on this matter. Wyoming Territory gave women the vote in 1869, Mrs. Holbrook added. The frontier's not as backwards as you city folk think. Grimm looked around the room at the workers with their crossed arms, at the judge with his stern expression, at the minister shaking his head. His hand went to his coat pocket, perhaps reaching for another document, or possibly something more sinister. Elias stepped between Clara and Grimm in one fluid movement. The lady makes her own choices here, he said softly, and I think she's chosen not to go with you. This isn't over, Grimm hissed. Mr. Weatherby won't stand for this insult. Then let him come himself, Clara said, surprised by her own boldness. Let him face me and these people directly instead of sending messengers. Grimm gathered his papers, shoving them into his case with shaking hands. You'll regret this, all of you. He pushed past the workers, who let him go. They watched through the windows as his buggy departed, wheels spinning in the mud. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Holbrook began pouring coffee for everyone. The judge accepted a cup gratefully. You know Weatherby will come back, he said to Clara. Men like him don't give up easily when money's involved. Let him come. Clara looked around the room at these people who'd stood for her, not because they had to, but because it was right. I have something now I didn't have in Boston. What's that? Reverend Palmer asked. A community worth fighting for. The workers began dispersing, returning to their labor, but the tension remained, everyone knowing this was merely the first skirmish. As the cookhouse emptied, Elias lingered. Thank you, Clara said, for stepping in front of me. Didn't like how he was looking at you. Elias twisted his hat in his hands. Clara, I need to say something. She waited, watching him struggle with words. These past 2 weeks, having you here, it's changed things. The settlement feels different. I feel different. He looked at her directly then, and she saw years of loneliness and fresh hope warring in his eyes. I know you've got this mess with Weatherby to sort out, but when it's settled. He stopped, started again. That contract says you came here to marry a stranger. Well, I'm thinking why not choose the man right in front of you instead? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Elias, I'm not asking for an answer now. Just think about it. I can offer you honest work, a good home, partnership in the mill. It's not Boston society, but it's real. And He paused, touching his shirt pocket where his wife's photograph rested. I think I'm ready to try again, if you're willing. Before Clara could respond, young Timothy Chen burst through the door. Mr. Elias! Ryder's coming. Looks like Mr. Weatherby and maybe 6 men with him. Elias's face hardened. Get everyone to the main building, women and children to the cookhouse. He looked at Clara. This isn't over yet. Through the window, Clara could see dust rising from the road. Weatherby was coming to claim what he thought was his, but he would find more than he bargained for a community united, a woman who'd found her strength, and a quiet lumberman who'd just offered his heart. The cookhouse filled again as families gathered. Clara helped herd children to the back rooms while the men took positions outside. Through it all, Elias's question echoed in her mind. Why not choose the man right in front of you as Weatherby's party approached? Clara realized she already had her answer. She just needed to survive the next hour to give it. The riders stopped at the mill's entrance, Weatherby at their head. Even from a distance, Clara could see he was drunk, swaying in his saddle. The syndicate had sent enforcers with him, hard men with harder eyes. Clara Harrington, Weatherby shouted. Come out. You belong to me. Elias stepped onto the cookhouse porch. She belongs to no one but herself. We'll see about that. Lumberman. Weatherby dismounted clumsily, his men following. I've got legal rights here. You've got nothing, Judge Harrison said, emerging from the office with Clara's ledgers, except massive debts and fraud charges waiting to be filed. The confrontation was building to something dangerous. Clara could feel it in the air, thick as the coming rain. But she also felt the solid presence of the community around her, these people who'd taken her in, taught her their ways, stood between her and harm. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone, and that, more than any contract or coin, was worth fighting for. The confrontation with Weatherby ended without bloodshed, but barely. Judge Harrison's threat of fraud charges and the unified front of armed mill workers had forced him to retreat, cursing and promising legal retribution. But the damage was done within hours of his departure. A rider arrived from the bank in town. Clara was helping serve supper when Cranshaw burst through the cookhouse door, his face pale as flour. Elias, Judge, you need to see this. He handed over an official-looking document, heavy paper with the First National Bank of Oregon's seal embossed at the top. Elias read it, his expression darkening with each line. Foreclosure notice, he said quietly. But in the hushed cookhouse, everyone heard. The bank's calling in the mill's entire loan. We have 72 hours to pay in full or they seize the property. Can they do that? Tom Brennan asked. Judge Harrison examined the document. If Weatherby co-signed the original loan as managing partner, then yes. His debts become the mill's debts. And with what he owes, he shook his head. It's over $3,000. The cookhouse erupted in voices angry, frightened, desperate. These families had built their lives around the mill. Without it, they had nothing. The syndicate's behind this, Mrs. Holbrook said. They couldn't get the property through marriage, so now they're trying foreclosure. Clara slipped out while the arguments continued, returning to Widow Taylor's cottage. Something nagged at her memory papers she'd glimpsed while packing her mother's things, documents she'd barely understood in her grief. Her mother's trunk sat in the corner of her small room, still bearing the labels from Boston. Clara had avoided opening it fully, the memories too sharp. But now she knelt before it, lifting the lid with trembling hands. The scent of her mother's lavender sachets rose up, bringing tears. Clara pushed past the emotion, searching through layers of carefully folded clothing until she found what she sought, a Morocco leather portfolio. Her father's initials embossed in gold on the cover. Inside were documents she'd never properly examined. Her mother had guarded these papers even as creditors took everything else, insisting they were worthless, just sentimental remnants of better days. But Clara's time with the mill's books had taught her to read financial documents differently. Here, a certificate for 200 shares of Union Pacific Railroad, purchased in 1869 when the transcontinental line was completed. The creditors had seized her father's railroad bonds, but these were in her mother's maiden name, overlooked in the chaos after her father's death. And here another certificate, this one making her stomach lurch. Northern California Timber Holdings, 100 shares. Her father had invested in timber before his shipping business consumed everything. The company name was different, but the underlying assets. Clara spread the papers on her bed, cross-referencing with notes she'd made from Weatherby's files. The Northern California Timber Holdings had merged with two other companies 3 years ago, becoming the Pacific Northwest Timber Trust, which owned significant portions of the land surrounding the mill. She ran back to the cookhouse, portfolio clutched against her chest. The argument had intensified, some workers talking about sabotaging the mill rather than let the syndicate have it. "Stop," Clara said. Then, louder. "Stop! I think I've found something." She spread the certificates on the table. Judge Harrison leaned in, pulling spectacles from his pocket. "These are legitimate," he asked. "My mother kept them hidden. The railroad shares alone are worth—" Clara did quick calculations. "At current prices, perhaps $1,800? "That's not enough to cover the full debt," Cranshaw said. "But the timber shares," Clara pointed to the merger documentation. "If these transferred properly, I own part of the Pacific Northwest Timber Trust, the same trust that's trying to foreclose." Judge Harrison's eyes lit up. "A shareholder can't foreclose on their own property. It would be self-dealing, legally void." "More than that," Clara continued, finding her confidence. "As a shareholder, I have the right to inspect the company books, to challenge decisions that would damage the value of my investment." Elias had been silent, studying the documents. Now he looked up at Clara. "You could sell these, take the money and go back east. Start over." The cookhouse went quiet. Everyone understood what he was really asking. Would she choose escape or investment? Clara met his eyes steadily. "I could. The railroad shares alone would buy me a comfortable life somewhere else." She looked around the room at the faces watching her Mrs. Holbrook, who'd taught her to read the moods of an iron stove, the workers' wives who'd shared their skills, the children who played between lumber stacks. "But I'm not going anywhere," she said. "We're going to use these shares to save the mill." The room erupted in cheers, but Elias's expression remained serious. "Clara, you'd be risking everything. Everything I have came from you, all of you." She gestured to the assembled families. "You took me in when I had nothing but a fraudulent contract and wet clothes. You taught me to work, to build instead of just consume. I won't abandon you now." Judge Harrison was already making notes. "We'll need to move fast. I'll ride to Portland tonight. File an injunction against the foreclosure. Miss Clara, you'll need to come with me to prove your identity and ownership." "Portland's a full day's ride," Elias said. "In this weather, then we'd better start now." The judge stood. We need someone who understands the mill's books, too. I'll go, Elias said immediately. You're needed here, Clara said. If the syndicate tries something while we're gone, Tom can handle the mill. You're not going alone. They prepared quickly. Clara changed into her sturdiest dress, the calico from Mrs. Holbrook, now properly hemmed and reinforced. She packed the certificates carefully in oilcloth, adding Weatherby's most damning ledgers as evidence. As she gathered her things, she found the marriage contract still in her bag. She'd carried it all these miles, this paper that claimed to own her future. Clara walked to the cookhouse stove, opened the grate, and fed the contract to the flames. The paper curled and blackened, Weatherby's signature disappearing into ash. Good riddance, Mrs. Holbrook said, adding another stick of wood. Now let's make some coffee for your journey. They departed within the hour, Clara, Elias, and Judge Harrison in the mill's best wagon, drawn by 2 strong horses. The rain had started again, turning the road to thick mud. They would drive through the night, changing horses at way stations, racing against the foreclosure deadline. As they left the settlement, Clara looked back at the mill, its buildings dark except for the cookhouse where families gathered, keeping vigil. These people were counting on her, on papers her mother had hidden and choices she'd make in the next 2 days. The wagon lurched through a pothole, throwing Clara against Elias. He steadied her with one arm while handling the reins with the other, solid and certain despite the dangerous road. "Thank you," she said, "for coming with me." "Partners look out for each other," he replied simply. The word hung between them, partners. Not husband and wife, not employer and worker, but partners, equals working toward a shared goal. They drove through the darkness, Judge Harrison dozing despite the wagon's jolting. Clara found herself thinking about the morning Elias had asked his question, "Why not choose the man right in front of you?" She'd been too overwhelmed then to answer properly. But now, racing through the night to save everything they'd built, she knew her answer. When this was over, when the mill was safe and Weatherby defeated, she would tell him. Not because of any contract or arrangement, but because she'd chosen him, this quiet man who'd pulled her from the river, who taught her to read wood grain and find the strength beneath the surface. The rain increased, drumming on the wagon's canvas cover. They stopped at a way station to change horses. Clara's hands so cold she could barely hold the cup of bitter coffee the station keeper offered. "We'll make it," Elias said, watching her warm her hands. "The judge knows what he's doing. It's not the legal part that worries me." And Clara looked out at the storm. "It's what Weatherby and the syndicate might do when we block them. Then we handle that when it comes." He touched his shirt pocket briefly. That habitual gesture of remembrance. "Can't live afraid of what might happen. Anna taught me that. She faced her pregnancy knowing the risks. Said life was about choosing hope over fear." They climbed back into the wagon as fresh horses were hitched. Dawn was still hours away, Portland even further. But they pressed on, 3 unlikely allies bound by necessity and growing trust. The portfolio with its precious certificates sat heavy in Clara's lap, her entire inheritance, her last connection to her parents' world. She could have used it to buy her way back to respectability, to find another city marriage that would restore her social standing. Instead, she was racing through an Oregon storm to save a sawmill and the families who depended on it. Her hands bore calluses now. Her dress was frontier calico rather than Boston silk. She'd learned to stoke temperamental stoves and read ledgers for fraud, to hold boards steady while roofs were repaired. This wasn't the life her parents had planned for her, but it was the life she'd chosen, decision by decision, day by day. The wagon rolled on through the darkness. Behind them, the mill slept fitfully. Ahead, Portland waited with its lawyers and banks, its certificates and challenges, and somewhere between in this racing wagon, in this dangerous night, Clara felt more certain than she'd ever been. She was no longer the Boston girl who'd arrived with one glove and a fraudulent contract. She was becoming something else, someone else. Someone who could read both wood grain and legal documents, who could serve 50 men breakfast and face down corrupt businessmen. Someone who could choose her own future, and had. The rain continued, but the wagon never slowed. They had 48 hours left to save everything. Clara gripped the portfolio tighter and leaned into the journey, ready for whatever battles Portland would bring. Beside her, Elias drove steady and sure into the storm. And Clara realized that was what she loved about him, not grand gestures or pretty words, but this steadiness, this reliability. A man who would drive through the night because it needed doing, who would stand between her and danger without being asked. The man right in front of her. Indeed. The Portland courthouse stood like a fortress of red brick and limestone, its clock tower presiding over the muddy streets below. Clara had never felt smaller than when she climbed its granite steps, her calico dress still damp from the journey, her boots leaving marks on the polished floor. But the papers in her portfolio were properly filed, the injunction granted. Judge Harrison had worked through the night with Portland lawyers, establishing her standing as a shareholder. The foreclosure was frozen, at least temporarily. Now came the harder battle, the public hearing that would determine the mill's fate. They'd returned to find the entire settlement mobilized. Word had spread through the valley that the mill's ownership would be decided at a special town meeting. Families from miles around had gathered, cramming into the town hall that normally hosted barn dances and Sunday services. Clara stood at the side door, watching the crowd assemble. She'd considered wearing her one remaining silk dress, the last vestige of her Boston life. But Mrs. Holbrook had stopped her. "You're not that person anymore," the older woman had said. "Show them who you really are." So Clara wore her work dress, blue calico, worn soft from washing, the hem still showing water stains from helping during the storm repairs. Her hands bore their calluses openly. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun like the other millwives wore. She looked nothing like the Boston heiress who'd arrived 3 weeks ago. She looked like someone who belonged here. "They're ready for us," Judge Harrison said. He'd barely slept in 3 days, but his eyes were sharp with purpose. The town hall erupted in noise as they entered. Clara saw the Mill families clustered on one side, Tom Brennan and his wife, the Chens with their children, old Pete who sharpened the saw blades. On the other side sat the syndicate representatives in their city suits, papers spread before them like weapons. And there, slouched in the front row, was Jonas Weatherby. Clara barely recognized him. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his face bloated from drink, his hands shaking as he lifted a flask to his lips despite the early hour. When he saw her, his bloodshot eyes narrowed with something between rage and desperation. Mayor Thompson called for order, his gavel carved from local oak ringing against the podium. Behind him, an American flag with 38 stars hung beside the Oregon state seal. A court stenographer, a nervous young man with steel-rimmed spectacles, prepared his instruments. "This hearing will determine the rightful control of the Cascade sawmill and associated timber rights," the mayor announced. "All parties will have opportunity to present their claims." The syndicate's lawyer rose first, a thin man named Hartwell, with the predatory look of someone who enjoyed destroying things. "The matter is simple," he began. "Mr. Weatherby, as managing partner, has negotiated in good faith with the Pacific Northwest Timber Trust for the sale of all assets. The foreclosure action is merely a formality to clear certain encumbrances. Encumbrances like the families who built this mill," Tom Brennan called out. "Order," the mayor said, though his sympathy was clear. Hartwell continued, outlining the syndicate's plans in language that sounded reasonable until you understood what it meant. Maximum resource extraction meant clear-cutting every tree. Efficiency improvements meant firing local workers and bringing in desperate men who'd work for nothing. Modernization meant destroying everything that made the mill sustainable. When he finished, Judge Harrison rose. "Miss Clara Harrington would like to address the assembly." Clara stood on unsteady legs. The room seemed vast, all those faces turned toward her. She saw Elias near the door, positioned where he could watch both her and Weatherby. His presence steadied her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice thin at first, then gaining strength. 3 weeks ago, I arrived here with nothing but a fraudulent contract and expectations built on lies. I came because I was told Mr. Weatherby was a prosperous businessman who would provide security. Weatherby snorted from his seat. "Instead," Clara continued, I found something better. I found a community that took me in, taught me the value of honest work, showed me that wealth isn't measured in bank accounts but in the connections between people. She opened her portfolio, displaying the certificates. These shares, inherited from my parents, make me a partial owner of the very trust trying to foreclose. As such, I have certain rights. Hartwell jumped up. Those certificates could be forgeries. They've been verified by 3 separate banks in Portland, Judge Harrison said. Would you like to see the notarized statements? Clara pulled out more documents. Furthermore, I've examined the mill's books extensively. Mr. Weatherby has been selling the same lumber multiple times, pocketing advances without delivering product. That's fraud. Slander. Weatherby lurched to his feet. It's documented, Clara said, showing the ledgers. Here, in your own handwriting. Sherman Brothers, paid in full for lumber never delivered. Watson Company, same. Mackenzie Construction, charged for premium wood. Sent inferior cuts full of shake and rot. The crowd murmured angrily. Many had dealt with those companies, their own reputations damaged by Weatherby's deceit. But that's not the worst of it, Clara said. Mr. Weatherby claimed to own the mill outright, but he doesn't. Mrs. Margaret Foster still owns 20%, which he's hidden from everyone, including the syndicate. Hartwell's composure cracked. That's impossible. We researched the title thoroughly. You researched what Weatherby showed you. Clara produced another document. This is the original deed of transfer. See this clause, Mrs. Foster retained a 20% interest, with right of first refusal on any sale. She never agreed to this foreclosure or the syndicate deal. Where is Mrs. Foster? The mayor asked. Here, a strong voice called from the back. The crowd parted as an elderly woman walked forward, spine straight despite her years. I received a telegram from Judge Harrison. Took the train from Salem soon as I heard what was happening. Mrs. Foster looked at the assembly. My husband and I built this mill from nothing. We planted half the trees on that mountain ourselves, knowing our grandchildren would harvest them. The agreement was always sustainable, cutting take only what can be replaced, leave the forest healthy for the next generation. She turned to Weatherby with disgust. You were supposed to be a caretaker, not a destroyer. I never agreed to any sale, especially not to clear-cutters. This is conspiracy, Weatherby shouted, whiskey heavy on his breath. That woman is mine, bought and paid for. He pulled out his crumpled contract. See $500. She belongs to me. The hall went silent. Even Hartwell stepped away from Weatherby. I belong to no one, Clara said quietly, but her voice carried. That contract was signed without my consent when I was in mourning, desperate, and without options. But even if it were valid, which Judge Harrison has ruled, it is not. I would rather work in this cookhouse forever than bind myself to a man who sees people as property. You have no choice. Weatherby advanced toward her, but Elias stepped from his position by the door, placing himself between them. The lady has made her choice clear, Elias said. And who are you to interfere? Weatherby demanded. Some nobody lumberman. I'm someone who understands that partnership means equality, not ownership, Elias replied. Something you never learned. Weatherby swung at him, a wild, drunken haymaker. Elias simply stepped aside, letting Weatherby's momentum carry him into the podium. The mayor's gavel went flying as Weatherby crashed to the floor. I think we've seen enough, Mayor Thompson said, retrieving his gavel. Mr. Weatherby is clearly unfit to manage anything, let alone a vital community resource like the mill. Tom Brennan stood. I'd like to speak for the workers. The mayor nodded. We've operated this mill for 20 years, Tom said. We know every tree on that mountain, which ones to cut, which to leave for seed. We know how to read the watershed, how to prevent erosion. The syndicate would destroy in one season what we've spent decades building. Other workers stood, one by one, testifying to their sustainable practices, their families' futures tied to the forest's health. The Chen children sang a song about replanting day. Old Pete showed his worn hands. 60 years of honest work carved into the skin. Clara watched Weatherby struggle to his feet, Hartwell distancing himself from his former client. The syndicate's case was falling apart, but she had one more card to play. "I propose a solution," she said. "I'll use my railroad shares to buy out Mr. Weatherby's interest entirely. Mrs. Foster and I will become co-owners, with the workers holding a collective share. The mill will operate as a cooperative, profits shared among all who labor here." The room exploded in discussion. Hartwell tried to object, but the mayor overruled him. Clara's proposal was legal and more than fair. "This is outrageous," Weatherby screamed. "She was nothing, a ruined Boston princess with empty pockets. I offered her salvation." "You offered her servitude," Mrs. Foster said. "There's a difference." The mayor called for a vote among the town's registered citizens. The decision was unanimous. The mill would transfer to Clara and Mrs. Foster's cooperative ownership. The syndicate's claims were void, and Weatherby would be bought out at a price to be determined by independent assessors. As the gavel fell, finalizing the decision, the hall erupted in celebration. Families embraced, children cheered, and more than a few grown men wiped away tears. The mill was saved. Weatherby stumbled toward the door, Hartwell abandoning him entirely. As he passed Clara, he hissed, "You've ruined everything." "No," Clara said. "I've chosen to build something instead." The crowd surrounded her, then Mrs. Holbrook with tears streaming down her face. Tom Brennan shaking her hand so hard her arm ached, the Chen children hanging from her skirts. Through it all, she looked for Elias. She found him by the door, watching with that quiet smile she'd learned to read. Their eyes met across the chaos, and she saw pride there, and something deeper, a question he'd asked days ago, still waiting for an answer. Judge Harrison raised his hands for quiet. "There's still paperwork to complete, but I think we can safely say the mill is secure. Miss Harrington, Mrs. Foster, gentlemen of the mill, shall we adjourn to draw up the partnership papers?" As they filed out, Clara paused beside Elias. "Thank you for standing between us." "Always will," he said simply. "If you'll have me." The answer she'd carried from Portland rose to her lips. But this wasn't the moment, not yet. There would be time, after the papers were signed and the future secured, to speak of personal choices and partnerships that went beyond business. For now, she took his offered arm and walked into the afternoon light, where the settlement waited to celebrate. The mill's whistle blew, a sound that had meant shift changes and quotas, but would now mean something more: a community's victory, a woman's independence, and the promise that some things were worth fighting for. In the crowd, she spotted Weatherby's buggy departing. The man himself slumped in the back. The marriage contract he'd waved so desperately was nothing but ash now, its power as illusory as his promises. Clara touched the calluses on her palm, those small marks of transformation. 3 weeks ago, she'd been someone else, softer, perhaps, but also weaker. Now she stood in a frontier town hall, having faced down powerful men with nothing but truth and courage. The celebration continued into evening, but Clara's mind was already turning to tomorrow, to the work of building something sustainable and good. The mill would need new contracts, honest ones. The workers would need to understand their new roles as part owners. Mrs. Foster's experience would be invaluable, and Elias patient. Steady Elias deserved an answer to his question. But that would come tomorrow, in quieter moments. Tonight was for the community, for the families who'd risked everything on the testimony of a Boston stranger who'd chosen to become one of them. The sun set over the mountain, painting the forest gold. Somewhere up there, trees grew that children yet unborn would harvest sustainably, carefully, with respect for what the land provided. Clara had come west, seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Instead, she'd found something better: independence, community, and the knowledge that she could build rather than merely inherit her future. The gavel that had sealed her freedom sat on the podium, carved from local oak by local hands, like everything here. It was both practical and beautiful, shaped by work and worn by use, like Clara herself, transformed from ornament to partner, from passenger to participant in her own life's direction. 3 months had passed since the town meeting, and the Cascade sawmill hummed with renewed purpose. Clara stood at the office window, watching the morning shift arrive. The men walked differently now, shoulders straighter, steps more purposeful. They weren't just workers anymore, they were part owners, with a stake in every board cut and every tree planted. The ledgers before her told a story of transformation. Under the cooperative model, production had increased by 20%. More importantly, the quality issues that had plagued Weatherby's tenure were gone. Every shipment met its promised grade. Every delivery arrived on schedule. The mill's reputation, once nearly destroyed, was rebuilding with each honest transaction. Mrs. Foster sat across from her, reviewing the replanting schedules. The older woman had moved back from Salem, taking residence in the old manager's house that Weatherby had abandoned. Her presence brought institutional memory and wisdom that no amount of education could replace. "The North Slope seedlings are taking well," Mrs. Foster said. "Your idea to stagger the plantings by elevation was inspired." "Elias suggested it," Clara said. "He understands the mountain's moods better than anyone." Mrs. Foster smiled knowingly. "Speaking of Mr. Thorpe, isn't there something happening this afternoon?" Clara tried to keep her expression neutral, but warmth crept into her cheeks. "Just a small ceremony. Nothing elaborate?" "My dear, the entire settlement has been preparing for 3 days. Mrs. Holbrook has baked enough to feed an army. The Chen children have practiced their flower throwing at least a dozen times. I'd hardly call that nothing." Through the window, Clara could see Elias at the saw, guiding a massive pine log onto the carriage. Even from here, she could see the concentration on his face, the careful precision of his movements. In 3 hours, those same hands would hold hers as they spoke their vows. The decision had come naturally, without grand declarations or dramatic moments. A week after the cooperative was established, Elias had asked her to walk with him after supper. They'd followed the path to the river, to the very crossing where he'd pulled her from the water. "I'm not good with words," he'd said, looking at the water rather than her. "But I know what I want. I want to wake up knowing you're there. I want to build something that lasts. Not just the mill, but a life. I want—" He'd stopped, pulled the daguerreotype from his pocket. "Anna would have wanted me to try again." She believed in second chances. Clara had taken his hand then, calloused against calloused. "I didn't come here looking for love. I came running from disaster, desperate and lost. But you, all of you, showed me I could be more than what I'd lost. And you specifically." She'd squeezed his hand. "You showed me that partnership means equality, trust, working together without words because the understanding runs deeper than speech. Is that a yes? That's a yes." Now, as Clara closed the ledgers and prepared to transform from bookkeeper to bride, she felt none of the anxiety that had accompanied her journey west. This wasn't a contract arranged by others for financial benefit. This was a choice, freely made, between equals. "Mrs. Holbrook intercepted her at the cookhouse. "None of that now, Mum. You're not lifting a finger today. Sarah Brennan and Mary Chen have your dress ready at Widow Taylor's." The dress was simple blue wool that would serve for Sundays and special occasions long after today. No white silk that would yellow in storage, no elaborate veil that would gather dust. Just good, practical beauty that could weather years of use. Sarah had embroidered tiny pine trees along the collar. Mary had sewn pearl buttons, Clara's mother's buttons, saved from the one good dress that had been sold. "You look perfect," Widow Taylor said, pinning a sprig of cedar to Clara's hair. "Like you belong here." The ceremony was held by the river, on a small rise that overlooked both the water and the mill. Reverend Palmer stood ready with his worn Bible. The entire settlement had gathered workers still in their sawdust-covered clothes, women holding babies, children fidgeting with barely contained excitement. Elias waited by a rough altar the workers had built that morning, pine planks sanded smooth, decorated with autumn leaves and late wildflowers. He wore his one good shirt, boiled white and pressed. His hair was slicked back, revealing the full strength of his face. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression, a loosening of old grief, a welcoming of new joy. Clara walked through the gathering alone. No one to give her away, because she wasn't property to be transferred. She came to Elias as herself, complete and choosing. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Palmer began. But Clara barely heard the familiar words. She was aware only of Elias's hands holding hers, the calluses matching her own, the steady strength of his grip. When prompted, she spoke her vows clearly. "I promise to be your partner in all things, in work and rest, in plenty and want, in joy and sorrow. I promise to build alongside you, to stand with you against whatever storms may come." Elias's voice was quieter but no less certain. "I promise to respect your independence while cherishing our unity. I promise to support your dreams as fiercely as my own. I promise to choose you again and again each day we're given." When Reverend Palmer pronounced them married, Elias kissed her with careful tenderness, mindful of the watching crowd. But Clara felt the promise in it, years of deeper kisses to come, private moments in their own space. The celebration moved to the cookhouse, where Mrs. Holbrook had indeed prepared food for an army. The tables groaned under the weight, venison roasted with herbs, potatoes mashed with cream, green beans put up from summer's harvest, pickles and preserves, fresh bread and churned butter. The wedding cake was simple but generous, 3 layers with blackberry jam between, covered in white frosting that Mrs. Holbrook had whipped until her arms ached. Tom Brennan stood to speak, his cup of cider raised. "When Miss Clara arrived, we thought we were getting a city lady who'd wilt at the first hard day. Instead, we got a fighter who saved our mill and our futures. Elias, you're a lucky man. Clara, you're one of us now, permanent and proper." Other toasts followed, some eloquent, some stumbling, all sincere. The Chen children performed their flower dance. Old Pete played his harmonica. As the sun lowered toward the mountains, painting everything gold, the workers unveiled their wedding gift. "We built it in sections," Tom explained, leading them outside. "So you wouldn't know. It's about a half-mile up the ridge, that spot where Elias always said he'd build someday." The cabin sat perfectly positioned, sheltered by pines, but open to the valley view. Close enough to the mill for easy walking, but private enough for a married couple. It was small but solid, built with the best lumber the mill produced. The door was painted blue, windows already glowing with lamplight someone had lit in preparation. "The women handled the inside," Mrs. Holbrook said. "It's not fancy, but it's comfortable." Clara couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. These people, who had so little, had given their time and skill to create a home. Elias's hand found hers, squeezing gratitude neither could voice. As evening fell, the celebration continued at the cookhouse, but Clara and Elias slipped away to their new home. The cabin was indeed comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a proper stove smaller than the cookhouse monster but solid iron, a bedroom with a bed made from pine and strung with new rope, and 2 smaller rooms that waited empty. "For the future," Elias said, seeing her look at them. "When we're ready." Clara had brought her few possessions from Widow Taylor's, Elias his from the bachelor quarters. Combined, they barely filled the shelves he'd built along one wall. But on the mantel sat 2 photographs, his Anna in her brass frame, and a new one taken just last week by a traveling photographer, showing Clara at the mill's books, pencil in hand, completely absorbed in her work. "I have something for you," Elias said, from beside the fireplace. He retrieved a wooden box, carved with intricate patterns of pine boughs and river stones. The craftsmanship was exquisite, hours of patient work evident in every line. Clara opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in blue cloth, lay her mother's silk glove, the one she'd kept through everything. But beside it sat another glove, its twin but different. This one was made of the softest deer hide, dyed to match the silk's shade, sewn with stitches so fine they seemed impossible for Elias's large hands to have managed. "You kept one glove from your old life," he said. "I thought you should have a complete pair, old and new together, making something whole." Clara lifted both gloves, silk and leather, Boston and Oregon, past and future joined. "How long did this take you?" "Started the day after the town meeting. Figured if you said yes, you'd need something that honored where you came from while celebrating where you are." She kissed him then, properly and privately, with all the feelings she'd held back at the ceremony. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. They settled into the evening's rhythm, Clara at the table with the mill's books, planning next month's orders, while Elias sat by the fire, carving what looked like a toy horse. The domesticity felt natural, as if they'd been sharing space for years rather than hours. "Mrs. Foster mentioned the Hendricks children," Clara said, not looking up from her ledger. "Their parents died of fever last month. The church has been caring for them, but they need a proper home. 3 of them, right ages 5 through 11. Yes, they're good children. The oldest boy, Samuel, already knows his way around the mill. The girls are quick and helpful." She set down her pencil. "Those empty rooms seem awfully wasteful." Elias smiled, that slow, rare expression that transformed his face. "Anna always said a house wasn't a home without children's voices. Might be nice to hear laughter in those rooms. We're barely married 3 hours and already planning a family of 5. We're practical people. Why wait for what we know is right?" Clara moved to sit beside him, watching his hands shape the wood. The toy horse was taking form, legs sturdy enough to survive a child's enthusiasm, details careful enough to spark imagination. "We'll talk to Reverend Palmer tomorrow," she said. "See what's needed." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the distant sound of celebration still drifting from the cookhouse. Clara's wedding ring, a simple band Elias had carved from heartwood, caught the firelight. On the table, the mill's books lay open, showing healthy profits that would be shared among all the worker owners. Above the mantel, 2 photographs watched over them, past and present at peace. The wooden box with its paired gloves sat on the shelf, silk and leather side by side. Tomorrow they would rise early. Clara to the cookhouse and books, Elias to the saws and forest. They would work alongside their community, building something sustainable and good. They would speak to the Reverend about the Hendricks children, perhaps bring them home by week's end. But tonight, they had this, their own cabin, their own fire, their own chosen future. Clara leaned against Elias's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing, calluses matching. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Clara thought of the Boston townhouse, stripped bare by creditors, the marriage contract, now ash in the cookhouse stove, the girl in silk gloves who'd believed security came from others' provisions rather than her own efforts. "None," she said. "I found what I didn't know I was looking for," which was a true partner, a real home, a life built rather than inherited. She turned to look at him directly. "You?" He set aside the carving, pulling her closer. "The man right in front of you. The only man I'd choose." Outside, October wind rustled through pines, carrying the scent of coming rain. The mill wheel turned in its steady rhythm. The settlement settled into sleep, secure in its cooperative future. Inside the cabin, Clara and Elias sat before their fire, planning a life measured not in silk and certificates, but in honest work and chosen family. The empty rooms waited for children's voices. The carved horse waited for small hands. The future waited, uncertain but unafraid. They'd begun as strangers bound by false contracts and others' expectations. They'd become partners through trial and choice. Now they were something more, a family just beginning, rooted in this valley, growing ring by ring like the trees they tended. The fire burned low, stars emerged above the mountain, and in a small cabin built by community hands, Two people who'd learned to read each other like grain and wood began their married life, complete and content in their mutual choosing. The paired gloves, silk and leather, caught moonlight through the window. Perfect metaphor for a union that honored both past and future while living fully in the present moment. I've told you Clara's story as it was told to me, passed down through generations of mill families who still remember the woman who saved their livelihoods. But in truth, it's not really about Clara, or even about Elias. It's about something I've come to understand only as I've grown older, that gratitude and family are inseparable threads in the fabric of a meaningful life. Clara arrived with nothing but legal papers defining her worth. She left Boston believing family meant blood and inheritance, that security came from what others provided. But that Oregon mill taught her teaches us that family is built from choices, not chromosomes. Every meal Mrs. Holbrook shared, every board Tom Brennan helped her hold, every skill the mill wives taught, these were acts of adoption, bringing a stranger into kinship through generosity rather than genealogy. The real bridge in this story isn't the river crossing where Elias saved Clara. It's the connection forged between people who choose to see past surface differences to deeper needs. Clara's gratitude transformed her from recipient to participant, from helped to helper. She learned that thankfulness isn't just politeness, it's the recognition that we're all holding each other up, that today's rescuer is tomorrow's rescued. That's what family truly means, choosing to be grateful for each other, daily, deliberately, despite everything.